Introduce our speaker this evening. I was very impressed with his introduction at our last meeting and the award he got. This evening, he is going to give us a speech. His introduction, there are many words that mean something familiar to us in regular English, but which also have technical meanings. The current election season has highlighted one of those words. In Project 5, the abstract concept, from the Advanced Communications Series Manual, Speaking to Inform, Lloyd Smith will discuss that word and why it's important to understand its technical meaning. Lloyd Smith, Errors and Expectations.
I don't know if any of you noticed, but there is an election coming up here pretty soon. In fact, the first candidate in this election announced his candidacy 564 days ago. It just seems like yesterday, doesn't it? And the next one will start next week, by the way, so be ready for that. One of the things that you've probably seen all through these 564 horrible days is public opinion polling, the constant feature of the elections. And the results are always expressed in something like, Clinton leads Trump by 4 points with a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. So the question is that word error, because if you think about it, why should there be an error? They're just counting up a bunch of people. So how come they can't just count them? And so the abstract concept I want to talk about is the notion of error. Now, in ordinary English, when all of us say error, what we mean is a mistake. You add 2 plus 2 and you've got 5. That's an error, right? But in statistics, that's not the case. Error in a statistical sense is the fuzziness or the uncertainty in any kind of data. Think about this for a moment. Suppose I brought in 3 or 4 or 5 gallon pails of loose pennies and then dumped them on the table, and all of you counted all of the pennies. Would anyone in here like to bet that you would all get exactly the same number? No, not at all. In fact, if you think for a moment, if you counted the pennies twice, do you think you'd get the same number? Not at all. There's uncertainty in all data. We don't like to believe that, especially in election. We like to think that the count is perfect and exact. It cannot be. That's because of the concept of error. Now, when they talk about the margin of error in a poll, they're actually talking about something called the standard error, or the standard error of measurement sometimes. Here's an explanation of that from my statistics textbook. The standard error is the standard deviation of the sampling distribution of a statistic, most commonly of the mean. Well, yeah. The term may also be used to refer to an estimate of the standard deviation derived from a particular sample used to compute that estimate. For example, the sample mean is the usual estimator of a population mean. However, different samples drawn from that same population would in general have different values of the sample mean. So there's a distribution of the sample means, each with its own mean and variance. The standard error of the mean, or standard error of measurement, that is, using the sample mean as a method of estimating the population mean, is the standard deviation of those sample means over all possible sample means of a given size drawn from that population. Well, I think that pretty much explains it. Nobody went to sleep, which is a good thing. That's a problem when you're talking about statistics. But what does that mean in the real world? Okay, let's think about this for a second. When they do a public opinion polling, when they say they've sampled the population, and of all likely voters, 4% more are in favor of Clinton than for Trump, for the standard error of plus or minus 3, and they don't usually say this, but they mean a confidence level of 95%. Here's what they mean by that. The stats are good enough that if they did the same poll with the same universe, the population of all likely voters, say 100 times, 95 of those times, it would come out plus or minus 3 of the true number. And that's pretty good. In fact, that's as good as it gets in stats. There's no way to do more than that. Now, this is something that always amazes people, but if you were talking about the entire universe of likely voters, if you ask just 1,069 people, that's enough That's enough to get a 95% accuracy at ±3. That doesn't sound like it would be likely, but all of those statistical formulas have been worked out over like 400 years. I mean, they know what they're talking about. If you double the number of people you ask, you don't cut the error in half. You don't cut it at all, in fact. There's no point to double it. If you asked every single person, you wouldn't cut the error by anything either, but you'd spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing each poll. So 1,069 people. But here's the kicker. You gotta ask the right 1,069 people, and you gotta ask the right question, too. And you have to think about who was in that group of 1,069. So here are the common ways that polling can screw up, and it does screw up. That's a bad thing. It's a very bad thing if you're a candidate, you just paid $5 million for a poll that turned out to be wrong, and you based all of your advertising on that poll, and that has happened. The most recent victim was Mitt Romney 4 years ago. But anyway, you can do several things wrong. First of all, you can ask the wrong group of people. That happened in the presidential election in Alf Landon versus Franklin Roosevelt back in 1936. A magazine called the Literary Digest did a poll to find out what was going on. And they discovered that Alf Landon was going to crush Roosevelt. He was going to get 80% of the vote. And they published it. The problem is, 1936, the Depression was going on. And the magazine decided to sample its subscribers. Well, very few people subscribed to magazines during the Depression because they cost money. And most of those people had money. They were conservative Republicans, highly successful, and they were voting for Roosevelt. Oops, you know. So that magazine went out of business due to that embarrassment. Another thing that can go wrong in polling is asking the wrong question. They spend lots and lots of time and effort crafting these questions so that they don't produce knee-jerk answers of one kind or another that can be misinterpreted. Finally, the big thing that can go wrong is adjusting the numbers. Now, polling has to be done that way. If you just ask 1,069 people, you're not going to get the exact percentage of Latinos and college-educated whites and women and so on, all the subgroups that they talk about all the time. So they have elaborate formulas they use to weight those groups. If they got like just a little too few Latinos, they can weight them a little bit in order to make it work out. That's what victimized Romney 4 years ago. Do you remember when Ohio went to Obama? It took like a half hour for Romney to come out and concede. Well, the reason is his polling that he paid $5 million for showed he was going to win Ohio. And that's because the guy doing the polling saw the result and decided it didn't look right. And so he added 3 percentage points to Romney's total, just fudge factored it. And he turned out to be wrong. Romney didn't even write a concession speech, so they had to round up a speechwriter and have him write up a concession speech because he was convinced he was going to win. You know, he let the poll guy screwed up and did not give the $5 million back. So what does this amount to? What it means is that when you see these poll results, you got to think, this is a sample, okay? It's not the election. And it's a big, big mistake to react too much to these polls. One of the things all of the legitimate polling people will say is that when you have polls that are too close together, they get less and less and less reliable. Did you notice over about the last 10 days or so since this FBI director weighed in with his surprise announcement and then his equally surprising never mind a couple days later. They're putting polls like 2 days apart. All the polling people say, you got to ignore that. The population gets weary of being polled is what it amounts to, and that's the last error in sampling. People lie. They lie all the time in polls. I lie when I get called up because I want to just mess with them. If I've ever asked if, what my religion is, I always say Buddhist or something like that, just to mess with the results. The bottom line on all of this is that the error in polling that they talk about is not like a mistake. It's a statistical concept. And so you can count on the polls, but you got to know what they asked, you got to know who they asked, and you got to know when they asked it.
As always, Lloyd, awesome job on that. Don't you find the speeches that our members give really educational? I'm constantly learning from something one of our members talks about, or 2 or 3 of the evening.